I'm interested in urban theory and urban politics. And my main point is going to be that urban theory as we know it should be abandoned almost completely. And that we have to think the urban again precisely because of the specific environmental or ecological nightmare that we're in. In contrast to what most of the environmental elites make us believe, that the ecological catastrophe is to come. My argument is going to be that the ecological catastrophe is already, no, not in Portsmouth, Plymouth, where am I? Plymouth, sorry. Or in Portsmouth for that matter. It is somewhere else. But I'm going to argue that this actually existing socio-ecological catastrophe that is already there has everything to do with Plymouth or Portsmouth or London or Manchester. And that's precisely that needs to be thoroughly understood if you want to be serious about thinking through the relationship between urbanization, cities, ecology, environment, and socio-ecological inequalities. And that is what I would like to talk about. So from my little introduction, it may already suggest that I do not just think of the city as this extraordinary assemblage of things and bodies, which of course it is. The city is an extraordinary agglomeration of stuff and bodies. But I'd rather like to think of the city as a process of urbanization that is constructed in and through what Maria Kaika calls continuous socio-ecological flows. Some of you are eating here. Where does your food come from? What are the socio-ecological processes through which urban food is produced and reproduced, and through which we, as urban dwellers, as citizens of the city, sustain both our bodily and social life? What some at least argue is the pivot of urban life in a kind of post-industrial, high-tech, software-driven world. Now, next time you tweet, remember that by doing so, we are sustaining the socio-ecological catastrophe in the Great Lakes. Some of you may not know where the Great Lakes are. That's in Central Africa, where there is a genocide taking place of unseen and indeed unheard proportions, both ecologically and socially speaking. Every single gun that's in the hands of those kids shooting at each other is paid for thanks to our mobile phones, Apple computers, iPhones, etc., because the Great Lakes are the place where there is the greatest world reserve of coltan. Ever heard of coltan? It's the kind of stuff in your phone, in your computers, etc. And it's a vital ingredient. So we can only maintain any kind of high-tech urban environment by continuing this socio-ecological nightmare that is already taking place in the Great Lakes. Hence the connectivity between the kind of urbanization that Manchester is trying to portray as this kind of high-tech, post-industrial city, smart city, dematerialized, can only be done. Sustainable, of course, every city wants to be sustainable these days, can only be done through this extraordinary catastrophe that is being reproduced and sustained elsewhere. And the same is true, of course, for when Apple decides to come up with yet another iPhone 6 now, in a few months' time, next year, undoubtedly, right? What's the average lifespan of your laptop phone? 2 years at best? And of course, you all believe in sustainability, don't you? You don't throw it away, will you? You take it to the recycling center, don't you? Keep your soul white. Put it in the recycling bin. Turn your back, and you've done your ecological citizenship duty. Have you not? What happens to your mobile phone, computers, whatever, IT piece of equipment after it has been ecologically sensibly taken to the recycling center that Plymouth is making so much of as part of its sustainable strategy for the future, undoubtedly. What happens to it? Where does it end up? Where is the magic recycling factory for discarded IT equipment? What? You don't know? Come on.
Bangladesh.
Say again?
Bangladesh.
In Bangladesh. In India. In Senegal. We don't buy shit somewhere else. In fact, that's illegal, actually. Actually, it is illegal. The European Union that sets most of our European environmental policies does not allow the export of garbage to the global south. We're not allowed to dump our shit onto the global south. And that's quite fair enough. So how do they end up there, nonetheless? Are these companies doing something illegal? No, they can't do that. No, they export it for recycling. So there's actually recycling taking place in the slums of Delhi, the slums of Mumbai, the slums of Dhaka. Have you seen recycling centers there? Little kids disassembling the IT stuff in search for the platinum, the coltan, the few recyclable things in there. With iPhones it's particularly difficult because all sold together. Very, very difficult. Can you think of the environmental conditions in which that happens, the social conditions in which that happens? That's what I mean by combined and uneven socio-ecological development. And you know what? We don't give a shit. We don't even know. Yet this is an integral part of our process of urbanization, and this has to be understood. Or take the example of the great 400 ppm. The great 400 ppm, we reached it, what month are we now? December. We reached it in September, I think. Do you know what I'm referring to, the 400 ppm? What?
What is it?
400 ppm. No one knows what the 400 ppm is. Thank you, Malcolm. At least one. Your professors are fantastic, huh? Yeah. We have now reached, for the first time in the history, not just of humanity, in the history of the world, as far as we know, 400 parts per million of CO2, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. That's how it's measured, 400 ppm. It's parts per million, right? The reason why this was such an iconic number, the 400 ppm, because this is what we believe the concentration of CO2 was at the time that the dinosaurs were roaming Devonshire. From now onwards, we're in uncharted territory. And as we all know, of course, CO2 is the #1 greenhouse gas that is causing, and that is now beyond dispute, that is causing irreversible climate change, with all sorts of consequence implications associated with it. I'm not going to bore you with the implications of that per se. You're all familiar with that. But what I want to insist on is that 80% of the world's greenhouse gas output comes from urbanization. It's our processes. And it's the process that produces. That's why I have these big arguments with my architect colleagues at Manchester, who are all obsessed with sustainability, sustainable design, sustainable architecture, zero carbon houses. And I think what a nonsense this thing is, because they consider the city or the house as a thing. And yes, if you consider it as a thing and you look at the throughput of making this thing, you can make it carbon neutral. To make it as a living process, impossible, cannot be done. I challenge every one of you architects to try to calculate for me how you can make urbanization or buildings as a place of living and working in its flows carbon neutral. That would be a challenge for you guys and girls to do. So this is a few examples. And of course here we also dump our garbage. CO2 is nothing else than garbage. Yeah, it's like discarded iPods and iPhones, etc. CO2 is an unwanted industrial residue, right? which we now desperately try to dump somewhere, to store it. Carbon storage, it is called. Yes? And how do we do carbon storage? Well, we turn carbon first into a commodity, into money. What's the price of carbon these days? How many pounds do I need in order to be allowed to dump a ton of CO2? How much is it? Are you not interested in environmental issues? Are you not concerned about climate change and what it will do? And you don't know the commodified value of the number one cause of this thing? Last time I checked, it was a while ago now, it was 8-9 euros for the ton. So people who store CO2, for each ton they store, they get 8 euros. That's kind of neat, isn't it? How much CO2 do you store? Have you set up a CO2 business? Why not? Seems to be sort of kind of interesting exercise here, right? Who's doing it then? Mainly the global south. Yeah? Costa Rica, Brazil, places like that, saying we're going to plant trees. 1,000 hectares of trees. 1,000 hectares of trees will capture X ton of CO2. Our shit in their trees. Condemning them to a continued process of combined and uneven spatial development. And as I said, is the urbanization process that is absolutely vital in that. So, this by way of introduction. Let me now go through my argument. I'm going to first start off by considering the strange case of 20th century urban thought, which is a strange case, 20th century urban thought. I will then go to rethinking urban theory in ways that takes nature seriously. Not as some sort of afterthought, not as some sort of thing on which we have some effects, something that is outside of us or the urban, but how we can bring nature in its very materiality into the way we understand urbanization and consequently the way we act in and on the city and the urbanization process. And as I said, I'm particularly concerned and interested with questions of socio-ecological power. That is the relationships through which fundamental uneven access to or control over socio-ecological configurations are constructed. That sounds smart, it's very simple. Yes? In many of the world's cities, 20 to 30% of the population does not have access to H2O, for example, water. That's why that's the number one cause of premature mortality in the world. 800 million people live in cities without easy access to water. It's the number one cause of premature mortality. Does that have anything to do with God or with nature? Nothing. It has only to do with unevenly constructed social power relationships over access to the very physicality that we call H2O. So I'm going to go through a number of perspectives that tries to deal with socio-ecological inequality. To conclude about how we can re-politicize the political ecology. And by that I mean we kind of know, well, those who are working in that field know that the world is socio-ecologically, that cities are socio-ecologically unevenly constructed. That's not that difficult to see. Everyone knows that. Despite the fact we know very well that that is the case, why is nothing happening? Why do we not act on it? And what is our role as urban intellectuals? That's what we are here today. In trying to think through ways of making or acting more performative, politically speaking. That's my conclusion. So if we consider the urban question, and the urban question, of course, is the title of a great book on urban theory by Manuel Castells in the 1970s, The Urban Question. Right? In the 20th century, as I'll argue in a moment, for most of the 20th century, the era of the city and of attempts to theorize the city was also simultaneously era in which our urban theories got rid of nature, which is a bit odd. It's a bit odd, particularly if you consider the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, proto-urban theories were acutely sensitive to the fusion of social and ecological, or social and physical processes in constructing unequal or uneven cities. Consider Friedrich Engels' masterpiece on the condition of the working class, which is really on the conditions of the city, my city, Manchester, in the mid-19th century. And how carefully he analyzed the class relationships that shaped Mancunian urbanity, and how that had also everything to do with nature. Right? Why were some people dying in some places of the city? Because of the rats, because of bacteria. And he was describing the ecological configurations even before we knew the word bacterium as a socio-ecological condition. He was analyzing how the elites were living in what part of the city? Upwind or downwind? Where would you want to live in the 19th century if you had the money, could afford it? Upwind or downwind from Manchester City? Upwind, would you not? That still today, if you look at the geography of Manchester, this uneven configuration has its roots in socio-ecological inequalities, carefully analyzed and understood by Engels, or someone like Karl Marx. In Capital Volume 1, page 116 in my Penguin edition, Marx describes and analyzes capitalism as a process of metabolism that produces new socio-natures. Usually, you know, when I read about that stuff in academic journals and the word socio-nature is used, it's Swyngedouw, 2006. And I think lazy academics, lazy students who don't go back to the originals, which I do quote and cite, in fact. It's already there. In Capital Volume 1, where Marx described capitalism not just a process of social transformation structured by class dynamics, but also as a metabolic process. That is, that the labor process is one that transforms the physicality of nature to turn it into tables, or orange juice, or pizzas. It's a process of metabolic transformation whereby new socio-ecological configurations are produced. And that was not unusual in the 19th century. I can't go through the details of the kind of sociologists of la lettre, some of them very conservative and reactionary. But people like Malthus, Spencer, Kant, Schaeffel were trying as proto-sociologists. They were not called sociologists because the discipline did not exist yet in the academic division of labor, but they were concerned and tried to understand the world as a socio-ecological condition. And indeed urban practices too. Consider the great urban sanitation movements of the late 19th century, the slum clearances, etc., which you architects undoubtedly have heard about. What else was that than a gigantic operation in socio-ecological cleansing that transformed both the social as well as the material conditions of our cities? Was that not sustainability policy avant la lettre? So it's a bit odd then that in the 20th century, when urban theory became canonized, so to speak, that nature in its physicality, ecology, was systematically scripted out of our urban theorizations. It was censored, which is odd. And I'm not going to go to why I think that happened today. We don't have time to do so. I'm just suggesting that this is odd. This is strange. The first one was, of course, the great Chicago school called Urban Social Ecology, borrowing, in fact, all manner of metaphors from natural ecology to describe urbanity and urbanization and its patterning. In the case of Chicago, and then it became universalized. It was the first great urban theory, still taught, and as it should be. But nature, magically, strangely, disappearing from that. And when in the 1950s, the quantitative revolution, the great modelers, urban modelers came on, so to critique the Chicago school for its empiricism and superficiality, and turn the city into a mathematical model, that denaturalization even became more acute. It was all about land rent gradients, economic functions, econometrics. And then the great 60s came, yes, when the great critical theories and critical movements tried to dump everything that went before, labeling it as ideological and non-scientific. Emmanuel Castells was one of the great ones in the urban question. I hope you've read the book. From a Marxist perspective, in the first instance, people like Castells, Henri Lefebvre, David Harvey, Doreen Massey, Saskia Sassen later on, great urban theorists that in many ways gave us fantastic insights in the functioning of cities, but nature completely evacuated. That cannot be right. If the mission of theory is to account for the dynamics of the process of urbanization, which we now know is so much predicated upon continuous physical and material transformation, upon which urban sustainability or unsustainability is predicated, that our theories don't even mention it. And became further accentuated when the Marxist critique was critiqued by a whole host of post-Marxist perspectives, the feminist, the post-structuralist, the post-colonialist, the cultural turn. It's all about discourse, is it not? It's all about text. And again, we learned quite a lot from that. I don't want to dismiss this per se. I think it's absolutely vital what happened there, but I'm just trying to indicate the curious, strange absence in all these vast theorizations of the matter of nature. So we had to wait until the late 20th century, and it was not thanks to us, urban intellectuals and urban scholars, that the ecological question began to foreground itself, stare us in the face. Tentatively and very hesitantly in the 1970s, the urban ecological problem became gradually and slowly seen as a socio-political one. Nature is not just a matter of trees and birds and viruses and bacteria and seas and mountains. It's a socio-political problem. There was this great book, some of you may know it, of McHarg in 1969, Design with Nature. It stands, we have to do it with nature. Let's not go against it. Let's do it with it. We still assume that it's us and them. Yeah? Us and them. There's a nature out there and there's us humans out here in the city. But the great moment, of course, was the great resistance against nuclear energy. That's how I became an environmental activist and later an intellectual. I can't remember how often we marched through the field, Flanders fields, I'm Belgian, Flanders fields, to protest against nuclear energy, which became the stand-in the 1970s of the ecological conundrum that the advanced capitalist world was faced with. And we won. It was one of the few battles I've ever been engaged in that I actually won. With a little bit of help of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, yes. But at least I thought we won. I thought we won. Because now Cameron, your government, has decided that nuclear energy is indeed part of the country's energy futures. In the name of what? In the name of saving the planet. In the name of saving the planet from premature overheating. But in any case, at the time, this was certainly one of the symbolic moments where nature and environmental conditions became foregrounded. Also with a little bit of help of the Club of Rome, the report of 1972, which was focusing on the resource depletion, a classic Malthusian argument. The Club of Rome, mainly Harvard academics, not the most radical ones, that apparently were making this kind of radical argument that we are in trouble because we're running out of resources. Who is in trouble when we're running out of resources, first and foremost? The capitalist elites, of course, right? They are concerned that their world, their imaginary world cannot continue if we're running out of resources. So this classic Malthusian argument structured around scarcity is one, of course, that is eminently structured in and through an elite discourse. But nonetheless, it galvanized a lot of concern around the urban question, and that finally we saw in the global south, this galloping urbanization. That when we think about urbanization, we really should not think of cities like Plymouth or Manchester. Right? 21st century urbanity is Nairobi, Lagos, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Jakarta, 20+ million people. Now that's a city. That's what we're faced with. Plymouth sustainability is irrelevant with respect to the urban environmental condition we're in light of 21st century urbanization. And let's take that seriously. So the consequence of that was that by the 90s, a number of academics finally began to turn their gaze to an attempt at re-theorizing urbanization from scratch, but with nature, the physicality inscribed in the theorization from the very beginning, not as an afterthought or an add-on. Also by seeing the social, the urban and the physical not as separate, but as intimately intertwined in myriad ways, shaping all sorts of new socio-ecological configurations, many enabling for some people and others disabling for other people. And that led, for example, David Harvey to controversially say in 1996 there is nothing unnatural about New York City. New York City, just like any other city, is nothing else than an extraordinary assemblage of a continuous socio-ecological metabolic process that in its functioning combines the ecologies or enrolls, that's a better word, the Latourian enrolling, that enrolls the materialities from every nook and cranny of the world in its very functioning. And William Cronin's fantastic book on Chicago, where he was trying to rewrite the history of Chicago as a combined socio-ecological process. It's called Nature's Metropolis. It's a masterpiece. 1992, 1993, masterpiece. All right, so it's in that context of an attempt to re-theorize, from a critical perspective, to re-theorize the city as a combined socio-ecological process. It's from that context that concerns and issues with justice, equity, and equality again became foregrounded, but redefined. Equality, justice in the city, in the urbanization process is not just a matter of economic class, social position, which it is. But these are always infused by and structured through ecological processes and have to be understood like this. I'm going to briefly look at three perspectives. The first one I can actually forget about because that's the one that is utterly irrelevant, is the sustainability argument, and the urban sustainability argument. I maintain that we should ditch the word sustainability. In my class, I do not allow it anymore. It's intellectually vacuous, theoretically incoherent, and politically inconsistent. That's why there is a whole library written on it, of course. Yeah, precisely, because it's an empty signifier. I'll come back to that later. It means nothing and everything. Anyone against sustainability? Vacuous, empty. That's why Portsmouth University can say we are a sustainable city, university. Plymouth, keep on making mistakes here. Plymouth. Yeah, it's the same thing there. Yeah, yes, it's all interchangeable. Yeah. So sustainability, or the notion of sustainability, has become the master signifier of this realization that something is going on. And is simultaneously the name for the impotent acting that is associated with the attempts to deal with the urban socio-ecological conundrum. As you all know, this was first codified somewhat in the United Nations report in 1987. Don't want to go through that. But if you consider carefully the sustainability argument and weigh to the mass of stuff, although it all says the same vacuous thing, it's hardcore. It's hardcore, focuses on two interrelated understandings and perspectives. The first one is that, yes, we agree that we are not very good with the environment. We are utterly irrational and completely inefficient in the use we make of our environment. But don't you worry. We have at Plymouth and other great universities this fantastic talent that cannot come up with a more efficient and effective rational resource use that will make it possible for life as we know it to go on for a while longer. So it's based on the idea that with the proper eco from economic, ecological rationality and more efficient resource use associated with that, we can turn our urbanized lives that we lead so happily for a bit longer. This is, of course, a perspective that presumes that this socio-ecological transformation can be achieved through forms of technology-mediated management. Technology-mediated management. Don't drop your stuff in the garbage bin. Put it in the recycling bin. And my university is hilarious. My Sustainable Manchester. Yeah? Big thing. I'm not very good early in the morning. So when I go to my office, I'm eating a banana. And when I walk into my office, I have this boyish thing, to try to skillfully throw my peel in the garbage bin in my office and then see whether I managed to throw it or not. So one morning I walked into my office in a half awake eating my banana with my peel, and I was throwing it over my shoulder, turning around to see whether I've hit the target. My peel was on the floor, garbage bin gone. I thought, what the heck? Must have been the kind of night man. These are these usually African black-collared men that magically appear at night and magically disappear in the morning that empty my bins in Manchester. So it must have been one of these fairies that make my stuff disappear overnight that must have displaced my garbage bin. So I was looking around my office, which is not very big. No garbage bin to be found in my office. So I went next door to my colleague knocking on my door. I said, have you seen my garbage bin? He looked at me and said, don't you know? I don't know what. The university never tells me anything. I never know what the hell is going on. I said, no, what? They took away our garbage bins from the offices. I said, you must be kidding. No, 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 he said, we don't have garbage bins anymore in the offices. We now have recycling bins in the corridor. Yeah, one for organic waste, one for paper, one for residual waste, and a fourth one that I forgot. Right? That's a technology-mediated thing in the name of saving the planet. Extraordinary, isn't it? And so Manchester University claims to be a sustainable university. This sustainability argument, based on these two interconnected perspectives, does occasionally pay attention to the wider socio-ecological networks and the socio-ecological conflicts and compromises that are associated with delivering urban sustainability, but not very often. However, it's also based on a fantasy. In the strict Lacanian psychoanalytic sense of fantasy, a belief that a real harmonious social order in a harmonious ecological environment is possible. It's a fairyland. Who really believes that? If Plymouth would really become sustainable, that nature would be a harmonious place, that the socio-ecological relationships would be harmonious. It's a fantasy that is predicated upon the possibility of a socio-ecological harmony, and more worryingly, on a specific scientific understanding of nature, capital letter N, as singular, ordered, and inherently harmonious. Story goes more or less like that. Nature, in its various components and acting, is really nice and benevolent. We fucked it up. It's our human, excuse my French, take that out from the video thing. If we can manage to change our interaction with this externally conceptualized, idealized notion of nature, we can restore that, everything will be fine, because nature in itself is fine. I would argue that nature does not exist, or at best, nature doesn't give a damn. There are all sorts of natures out there. I don't consider the HIV virus to be inherently benign and harmonious. Should we sustain the HIV virus in the bodies of the sub-Saharan HIV sufferers? Or should we destroy it by all means possible? I don't consider tsunamis particularly benign or harmonious, or storms, earthquakes, volcano eruptions. There is no inherently harmonious nature out there that is in a nice sort of balance, and that we distort it, and therefore we have to come up with the proper institutional technocratic devices to restore that balance. That's a fantasy, but a very powerful one. And it reduces, or often silences, questions of relationally constructed inequality and inequity in socio-ecological configurations. So that's what I want to move on to. Jesus Christ, I have to speed up a bit. The first theoretical perspective, which is also an activist one, is usually put under the heading of the environmental justice movement, or environmental justice theorizations. It originated in the United States in the 1980s as a socio-environmental urban movement based on a very simple empirical observation It turned out that if we look at the physical ecologies of the city, that African Americans were proportionally living in much higher concentrations around toxic and environmentally damaging or dangerous conditions than white Americans. So you could easily observe a form of socio-ecological racism if you want. Right? You would find that in the UK too, in certain ways. Would you find many elites living around waste dumps? It's the same sort of notion. That the socio-ecological distribution of ecological goods, nice stuff that we want, clean air, green spaces, etc., and bad stuff, that the stuff that we all use but we don't want to see in our backyard, like chemical plants, toxic sites, industrial plants that have all these kind of nasty effluents, garbage going out into the waters, etc., is that mirrors a pattern of social distribution, which a number of people began to consider as a question of justice, or injustice in this case, of socio-ecological, environmental justice or injustice. Whereby the performative word is justice. It's an argument very much structured around the Rawlsian notion of justice. Rawls was a famous philosopher that thought of justice as a distributional thing. It's unfair if some people have to live around garbage dumps and other people can live nicely around the lake. That's unjust. It's a question of distribution. So it's based on liberal notions of justice, justice seen as fairness. It's unfair that some people are dumped somewhere and others elsewhere. It foregrounded race and ethnicity as the key axis around which this unjust socio-ecological distribution was structured, and focused on the procedures through which these distributional configurations were structured. Who decides where the garbage dump will be? Who decides where the chemical plant will be? Who decides where toxic things will happen? Well, that takes place through a set of public policy mechanisms, and given the particular class and social configurations of those who command the key decision structure, they're going to not put it in their own neighborhoods. They dump it on those that are not involved in the decision-making process, do not have the capacities, political, social, cultural capital to fight, resist these sort of decisions. And it focuses on environmental bads, as if there is no connection between the structuring of the bads and the goods. And it's very much localized. It's a NIMBYism. I don't want this shit in my backyard. Yeah? Not in my backyard. A NIMBYism. But it has to be in someone's backyard. But it did fantastic things. So it's quite an interesting perspective that thinks through the injustices or inequalities that structure urban socio-ecological processes. For the first time, we could speak about the socialized urban nature, that the physicality of nature cannot be disassociated from its sociality. By now, the environmental justice theorizations have been extended almost ad infinitum. Every possible social axis has been looked at. In addition to race or ethnicity, you can look at gender, class, disability, age, geographical scale, etc. And there tends to be a focus on the patterns of socio-ecological urban injustices and public decision-making processes. So that's the urban environmental justice perspective. The third one is mine. Well, it's not mine personally, it's the one that I articulate with. This is my kin. This is my kin in which I dwell theoretically and intellectually. It's called political ecology. I put urban in front of it because, as I've argued, urbanization is indeed the key perspective, the key entry point where most of the ecological and social processes that matter are happening, the only significant geopolitical ecology has to be an urban one. Geopolitical ecology, urban geopolitical ecology, is primarily concerned with the production, the making of urban socio-environmental inequalities. Here the performative term is not justice. Urban geopolitical ecologists don't give a damn about justice. We leave justice to the elites, considerations of justice. Here the performative operator is equality, political equality, something very different from justice. It's the production of urban socio-environmental inequalities through human, non-human assembling. Yeah, the fusion of things human and non-human, like this iPhone. That's a human, non-human assembling. Yeah? Like a cyborg, Robocop thing. Yeah? Part human, part physical. Or the bottle of water, it's the same. Right? The outcome of which is the production of natures, now with a small letter n, the heterogeneous stuff that we inhabit. There is nothing unnatural about an iPhone, or a bottle of water, or orange juice. So nature does not exist. It's produced. It's made. This is Neil Smith's infamous thesis. And that has now been confirmed by the geologists. You may have heard of the notion of the Anthropocene, right? Coined by Cutson in 2002, Nobel Prize-winning chemist, who argues that today humans have become part of deep geological time. We shape, co-shape at least, the very geological, deep time conditions of the Earth's functioning. The climate change is the classic of its kind, of course. Now these natures become increasingly enrolled in a capital accumulation and circulation process as a socio-metabolic process. Think of carbon dioxide, H2O, DNA in genetically modified tomatoes, for example. Metabolism is the process whereby physical matter, such as water or cows or coltan, are transformed into usable, ownable, and tradable commodities. It's precisely in that perspective that we can say that Harvey got this argument from there's nothing unnatural about Plymouth, New York City, or whatever. This metabolism is predicated upon the incorporation of natures within the social relations of property ownership and appropriation of nature within a capitalist surplus value metabolic production chain. It's a process of the commodification of nature, which is precisely the mechanism through which nature becomes and is now fully socialized. Now, I argue that large-scale urbanization of all manners of natures along these processes that are outlined is the spatial form of capital accumulation with all manner of unintended outcomes and highly uneven outcomes, precisely because of the social relational construction of that physical metabolic process. This perspective is decidedly anti-Malthusian. There's no scarcity in nature. Scarcity is something that is socially, politically, economically produced. Scarcity is precisely one of the necessary ingredients of a process that is predicated upon accumulation for accumulation's sake. And whereby the market has now become hegemonically constructed as the only allocation instrument to decide who has a right is entitled to nature. Therefore, the urban socio-physical environment embodies and reflects the power relationships inscribed in socio-ecological metabolisms. That's why if you disentangle the metabolic flow through which an iPod is made and unmade, you see these uneven urban geographies embedded within the metabolic process, and produces both the slums of Mumbai and IT-based urbanization in the global north. And of course, policies of all kinds matter in that. This process is multi-scaled. It has now become fully global. And what the political ecology does is try to put the emphasis on the political. And that needs to be further foregrounded. So I'm going to conclude by considering briefly the political and its dimensions. What to think if you really want to understand what is going on today. Do you know where that is? I can't see it very well. It's Istanbul in the summer. Taksim Square. What was happening in Taksim Square? What was the trouble about?
Trees.
A few trees in a park. A few trees in a park and the building of a shopping center that didn't look very good because of its cultural and historical connotations. What did it turn into? A massive, universalized political protest against the regime. From trees to the political. That's what I'm really interested in. I'm going to skip this. So how can we think through some of these politicizing elements? What needs to be thought to make these connections that Taksim Square expressed? In Sao Paulo it was the same. It was the price of a public transport ticket. If that is not a socio-environmental question of equality, I don't know what is. Turn into a massive politicizing element. Anyway, I'm quickly going through 4 domains that need urgent attention and need urgent politicization. That is, first of all, that urbanization, as Henri Lefebvre already foreshadowed in the 1980s, is now planetary. He called it planetary urbanization, which does not only refer to the fact that most of the world's population now lives in cities, that is, these assemblages of stuff together, but that urbanization, the urbanization year process, has taken planetary forms. And this process is a socio-environmental one that operates around the commodification and financialization of, for example, H2O, CO2, land, waste, genes, etc. I think that needs to be urgently teased out in a social and political architecture. Because it's precisely the form of planetary urbanization that leads to the present combined and uneven socio-ecological apocalypse. The ecological nightmare is already here, but not here. The best illustration of that are, of course, the ecological migrants, the environmental refugees that end up in Lampedusa, and even more end up on the bottom of the Mediterranean, of course. We see what happened in the Philippines, combined and uneven ecological catastrophe, or the disaster that is happening in the slums of Mumbai, in the recycling of our IT stuff. The second urgent theme is the contemporary process since 2008, 2009 of zombie post-neoliberalism. Yes. That's after the crisis of 2008, 2011, which announced the end of the neoliberal idea of privatizing everything. No one advocates it anymore, but there are no alternatives, apparently. So we keep on We keep on an extraordinary speed, turning nature, socializing nature to the process of commodification. That's a form of zombie post-neoliberalization, in which the state has now taken the central lead, the central role in this process of further deepening this process of combined and uneven ecological development. And through that, the democratic political is increasingly suspended. Do you know how to change the world? Do you? No, you don't. You feel disempowered. Have you seen Russell Brand talking to Jeremy Paxman? Exactly. He didn't do it very well. He's not a good intellectual academic, but he put his finger on what was precisely right, and you know it. But you don't dare to intellectually think it through. And that, nonetheless, is what I think needs urgent attention. We also have to think through, again, our focus on urban environmental movements. My students love them. My students love environmental movements, particularly environmental movements in the global south, in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, the people who fight, the communities who resist neoliberalization. We love our ecological poor to death. And I think we should stop doing that, because we're not helping very much here in handling the situation that we are actually in. Many of these urban localized environmental movements are reactionary, reaction in the sense that they are resisting. They want to stay where they are rather than transform into something else. They're localized. It turns ecological, socio-ecological catastrophe in just a set of complaints and grievances. So environmental movements mobilize a repertoire of grievances and the cultivation of victimhood. Also the normalization of excess and the deadlock of humanitarian ecologism. The deadlock of humanitarian ecologism is us, the ecologically sensible citizens. Do you pay £5 when you take a flight on holiday to offset your carbon? Ecological, humanitarian ecologism. Not going to do anything. And finally, this is my final slide, is that we really have to think through what we mean by nature when we talk about that thing out there. Think through the discursive construction of nature. What are the urban socio-ecological imaginaries upon which our obsession with sustainability is built? As I said, for me, nature and sustainability in the way they're being mobilized in the hegemonic discourses, particularly in architecture, planning, design, and associated fields, or empty signifiers. It does not exist. And I get this from Slavoj Žižek. It is precisely this emptiness which nonetheless is staged as harboring the promise of salvation that led Badiou, Alain Badiou, French philosopher, to argue that today ecology functions as the new opium of the people, perversely using his Marxist argument in the 19th century that religion is the opium of the people. He says today, Badiou argues, today ecology functions as the opium of the people, nurtured by the cultivation of ecologies of fear. That is, the world is going to disintegrate if we do not act now. That's, of course, a fear nurtured by the elites, whose civilization might be under threat, and totally disavows the actually existing socio-ecological catastrophe that is already happening. It's predicated upon seeing ecological coherence as panacea to solve social and economic injustices and inequalities, if we have a harmonious nature, if we restore this kind of mythical, non-existent balance, then the social will be nice too. That's the worst form of environmental determinism, which disavows radically the inherent political nature of the social. And most worryingly, it invites radical change so that nothing really has to change. A classic example here is Al Gore, the great pope of sustainable climate technologies. Have you seen An Inconvenient Truth? Yeah? It's really bad, eh? Well, bad in terms of what we're faced with. The documentary is great, right? Right? Do you remember the moment he gets on the ladder? Yeah, and CO2 is off the charts. Yeah? And what does he say at the end? It's 12:05. We got to act now, and we got to act radically. And he says, and we can. Yes, we can. He says, we can mobilize the right technological and social institutional configurations to bring CO2 down. And we need to do that in a radical sort of ways. To achieve what? Well, the civilization, as he knows it, can continue a bit longer. Yeah? That turns into a radically reactionary message clouded in a call for revolutionary change almost. Right? Is we have to act technologically, institutionally now so that nothing really has to change in the way we organize planetary urbanization in this combined and uneven socio-ecological ways that I've tried to explain. And I'll leave it with that. Thank you very, very much.